It was a Friday morning in May, the kind of morning that begins like every other and ends like nothing the world has ever seen. And by the time it was over, 35 people were dead. A quarter mile of bridge had vanished into Tampa Bay, and a man who had done everything right was left to carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. This is the full story. To understand what happened on May 9th, 1980, you first have to understand what the Sunshine Skyway Bridge meant to the people who used it. Tampa Bay in the mid-20th century was a body of water that divided as much as it connected. The bay stretches wide and shallow across the lower coast of Florida, its floor rarely deeper than 15 feet in most stretches, threaded through with a narrow dredge channel that allowed large commercial vessels to reach the port city of Tampa from the Gulf of Mexico. For decades, the only way to cross from St. Petersburg in Pinellas County to Bradenton in Manatee County without driving 50 miles around through Tampa was to take the B-Line ferry. For boats, departures every 30 minutes in winter, every 45 minutes in summer, and wait times that could stretch to 3 or 4 hours on a busy day. People knew it, people accepted it, and people talked endlessly about what it would mean to have a bridge. Construction began in October of 1950, with 544 workers and an entire temporary concrete factory established on the shores of Piney Point just to supply the project. They used more than 12 million pounds of structural steel, 8.5 million pounds of rebar, and enough concrete to fill a small stadium. By the summer of 1954, state transportation officials and the local Junior Chamber of Commerce had launched a nationwide contest to give the bridge a name. Over 20,000 entries arrived. The judges narrowed the field to 24 finalists, weighed names like Florida Sunspan, Gulfgate, and Sunland Skyway, and on the 4th of July announced their winner. A woman named Virginia Seymour from nearby Indian Rocks Beach had submitted 2 words that captured everything: Sunshine Skyway. It opened on Labor Day weekend, September 6th, 1954, and the day the bridge opened was the last day the B-Line ferry ever ran. The final crossing was made that evening by a captain named Jack McMullen, a 27-year veteran of the service, who brought the ferry Hillsborough across Tampa Bay one last time just before 10 at night. When it docked, the era of the ferry was over. People who had waited hours for a boat could now drive across in minutes. What they drove across was remarkable. The original Sunshine Skyway was a steel cantilever bridge, 15 miles long in total when you counted the causeways at each end, rising at a steep 5-degree grade from the flat water to a peak of 150 feet above the shipping channel below. The roadway at the top was made of a steel grating, and on clear days drivers could look straight down through the metal mesh to the bay churning far beneath their wheels. It was not a comfortable experience for everyone, but it was an experience, and it had an effect on people who made the crossing. You felt the sky around you. You understood, in a way that ground-level roads never quite conveyed, how vast this bay actually was. Within a few years, the bridge was carrying more traffic than it had been designed to handle. In 1967, construction began on a second span running parallel and just to the west of the original. It opened in 1971 and was dedicated exclusively to southbound traffic, while the original 1954 span handled northbound. Together, the 2 bridges created a 4-lane crossing that was the principal artery between Pinellas and Manatee counties, and by 1980, tens of thousands of vehicles used them every day. Commuters going to work, families heading south for the weekend, college students catching buses, truck drivers hauling freight, people living their ordinary lives on an ordinary crossing over an extraordinary stretch of water. Then came the year 1980, and in that year, Tampa Bay began to feel like a place the sea was determined to punish. On the night of January 28th, just over 3 months before the Skyway disaster, a United States Coast Guard cutter called the Blackthorn was leaving Tampa Bay after an extensive overhaul, heading home to Galveston. Spirits were high among the crew. They had been away for months, and they were finally underway. Conditions that night were calm and clear. And yet, in the channel just west of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, the Blackthorn collided with a massive oil tanker called the Capricorn. The tanker's 7-ton anchor became embedded in the cutter's hull, tore open her port side, and as the 2 ships pulled apart, the anchor chain snapped taut and capsized the smaller vessel in seconds. 23 Coast Guard sailors died that night. It was the worst peacetime disaster in the history of the United States Coast Guard, and it happened in the shadow of the very bridge this story is about. The bay had barely absorbed that loss when May arrived, and with it, something worse. John Laro was 37 years old in the spring of 1980, and he was, by every professional measure available, exceptionally good at his job. A harbor pilot in Tampa Bay is not simply a ship's captain. The role is more specialized and in some ways more demanding. When a large commercial vessel needs to enter or leave the port of Tampa, it is the harbor pilot, not the ship's own master, who takes command of the navigation. The pilot knows the bay. He knows its tides, its currents, the particular way water behaves around the shallow shells that border the dredge channel, the visual cues that mark the turns, the feel of the wind against a hull at different speeds. Laro had done this hundreds of times. He was days away from his formal promotion to full pilot status, the culmination of years of training and experience. He had earned it. On this particular morning, Laro was accompanied by a trainee named Bruce Atkins, 32 years old, an experienced mariner completing the final observation mission of his own pilot training. It was Atkins's last day as a trainee. He would shadow Laro through the transit, watch how a full pilot handled the ship in real conditions, and learn from proximity. For both men, May 9th should have been just another working day on the water. The ship they boarded was the MV Summit Venture, a Liberian flag bulk carrier owned by Hercules Carriers and operated under the flag of a Chinese shipping company called Huaquan. She was 609 feet long, built in 1976, and in the early morning hours of May 9th, she was riding high in the water because she was empty. She had departed Houston, Texas 5 days earlier and crossed the Gulf of Mexico to anchor off the entrance to Tampa Bay, where she had discharged most of her water ballast. Her mission was to proceed to the port, load 28,000 tons of phosphate rock, and carry it to Asia. Without her cargo, without the weight that would normally press her hull deep into the water, the Summit Venture sat 35 feet higher than she would fully loaded. In strong wind, an empty ship this size becomes something close to a sail. At 6:25 in the morning, Laro and Atkins boarded the Summit Venture from a pilot boat near Egmont Key, at the entrance to Tampa Bay, and prepared to make the 58-mile transit to port. The ship's own captain, Lu Suing Chu, formally relinquished navigational control to Laro, as maritime law required him to do. The bay's shipping channel is one of the longest in the world and one of the most demanding to navigate, and under compulsory pilotage rules, a certified local harbor pilot must be at the helm whenever a vessel of this size moves through its waters. Laro let Atkins take the wheel initially, the way an experienced professional might let a student handle a car on a straightforward stretch of highway, keeping a steady eye on everything and ready to step in at any moment. That morning, the weather at the entrance to Tampa Bay was ordinary Florida weather. Scattered storms sat to the north near Tarpon Springs and to the south near Venice, but at the mouth of the bay visibility was reported at 3 to 4 miles. Not perfect, but acceptable. Laro had worked in worse. He spoke by radio with the pilot station and confirmed the conditions. He checked the reports. He made the professional judgment that the transit was safe to begin, and he proceeded. There was no reason in the available evidence to do otherwise. The Summit Venture moved into the channel and began her long approach to the bridge. For the first hour and a half, everything proceeded normally. The Summit Venture moved through the channel buoy by buoy, Atkins at the helm and Laro watching. The morning rain coming and going in light showers that were nothing unusual for the Florida coast. Then, at a point approximately 4 miles from the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, something changed that no weather forecast had predicted and that no one on the ship could have seen coming. A squall dropped out of the sky. Not a gradual deterioration, not a worsening of conditions over time, but a sudden, violent wall of weather that meteorologists would later classify as a microburst. In less than a minute, wind gusts exceeded 70 miles per hour. Rain fell at a rate of more than 7 inches per hour. The bay around the Summit Venture effectively disappeared. Visibility collapsed to zero. Atkins, watching the radar screen, saw it go white. The intensity of the rainfall had overwhelmed the instrument entirely, washing the display into a useless blur of interference. They were blind. Laro stepped forward and took the helm from Atkins. This was the moment for which his years of training had prepared him, and he began working through his options with the controlled focus of someone who has made difficult decisions in difficult conditions before. The problem was this. He was closing on a 13-degree turn to port that would take the Summit Venture through the 800-foot gap between the two main piers of the Skyway Bridge. He needed to make that turn, but he could not see the buoys that marked the channel. He could not see the bridge. He could not see the bow of his own ship. And in the shipping lane ahead of him, traffic was moving, dropping anchor in a narrow channel with vessels approaching from both directions carried its own catastrophic risks. He made the decision that any reasonable professional might make in the same situation. He kept moving and trusted his instruments and his judgment. What Laro did not know, because no instrument on board could have told him, was that the squall had done something that almost never happens. It had shifted the wind direction from southwest to west-northwest in the space of seconds, and that shift had changed everything. He had mentally accounted for a southwest wind. A southwest wind, pushing from his right, would have nudged the Summit Venture in a direction that would carry her safely through the channel. The west-northwest wind that was actually pressing against her was pushing from a completely different angle, driving the hull sideways and off course, 800 feet to the right of where she needed to be, directly toward the concrete pier that held the southbound span of the bridge above the water. At 7:32 in the morning, the weather cleared marginally. For just a moment, a ray of light broke through the storm, and Laro saw the steel superstructure of the Sunshine Skyway directly ahead. Not where he expected it to be, not framing the channel around in the way it should have looked if everything were correct. It was in the wrong place entirely, and in the fraction of a second it took him to process what that meant, he already knew it was too late. He ordered hard left rudder. He ordered the engines to full astern. He had the anchors dropped. None of it was enough. The Summit Venture weighed nearly 20,000 tons, and she was moving at speed, and no force available to anyone on that bridge could stop her before she reached the pier. At 7:33 in the morning, the bow of the Summit Venture struck Pier 2S, one of the concrete support columns of the southbound span of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. The force of the impact sheared the pier 54 feet above the waterline. What happened next took seconds. 1,297 feet of bridge deck, nearly a quarter mile of concrete and steel roadway, twisted, groaned, and fell 150 feet into Tampa Bay. The sound reached shore long before anyone could see what had happened. On the bridge above, drivers were moving through a curtain of rain, so heavy they could barely see past their windshields. The road ahead of them had simply ceased to exist, and most of them had no way of knowing it. A car dealer named Richard Hornbuckle was heading south with 3 passengers for a golf game. Driving slowly in the rain with his hazard lights on, he pressed his brakes when the road ahead disappeared from view. His Buick skidded to a stop 14 inches from the edge of the void. The men got out, looked into the gap, and walked back from the brink in silence, struggling to comprehend what they were standing at the edge of. Former Major League Baseball player Granny Hamner stopped his car just short as well. A man named Anthony Goduz was in a vehicle that halted with barely a foot to spare, close enough that he got down on his hands and knees and clung to the steel grating of the roadway to crawl back from the edge. Those were the fortunate ones. For the others, there was no warning at all. 6 cars, a pickup truck, and a Greyhound bus bound from Miami drove into the gap or fell with the collapsing roadway and disappeared into the water far below. The Greyhound, number 4508, had departed the St. Petersburg station just 15 minutes earlier. It was the Friday before Mother's Day, and among the 26 people aboard were approximately 15 students from Alabama's Tuskegee Institute who had finished the school year and were heading home to Florida to see their families. 2 of them were best friends named John Calloway, 19 years old, studying mechanical engineering, and Linwood Armstrong, 20, an architecture major. They had planned the whole summer together. Armstrong had gotten off the bus one stop earlier in Tampa, planning to visit his mother in Plant City before meeting Calloway's family in Miami. He stepped onto a platform in Tampa that morning and never saw his friend again. The Greyhound was the last vehicle to go. It inverted as it fell and struck the surface of the bay on its roof. The youngest person aboard was a baby. The oldest was a 92-year-old woman named Gerda Hedquist who had been planning one final trip to her native Sweden. The driver was a 42-year-old man named Mike Curtin who lived on the same street as a local television anchor who would cover the story, never imagining as he drove to work that morning who the first casualty announced would be. One person survived the fall. Wesley McIntyre was 56 years old, a truck driver from Gulfport heading to his delivery job across the bay. He was driving his 1974 Ford Courier pickup when a road dropped beneath him. When he looked up and saw the black broadside of the Summit Venture in front of him with the words painted in white letters along the hull, and understood in an instant what had happened. His truck fell, struck the hull of the freighter, bounced off, and sank to the shallow bottom of the channel. McIntyre, a World War II Navy veteran, fought his way out of the sinking cab, pushed to the surface through the wreckage, and clung to debris until a crewman on the Summit Venture spotted him and hauled him aboard. He had been saved by the very vessel that had just killed 35 other people. On the bridge of the Summit Venture, John Laro grabbed the radio and broadcast his distress call. His voice was desperate and controlled at the same time, the voice of a man who understood completely what had happened and was already trying to stop more of it. He screamed into the radio, "Mayday, Mayday, Coast Guard, the bridge is down. Stop the traffic on the Skyway Bridge. There are people in the water. Get emergency equipment to the Skyway Bridge now." The Coast Guard at St. Petersburg answered, and the exchange that followed, recorded in full, became one of the most haunting documents of the entire disaster. Laro, standing 500 feet away from the collapse in the wheelhouse of the Summit Venture, absolutely helpless, pleading with responders to hurry. Bruce Atkins went out onto the wing of the bridge and was sick. He would later say that standing there, watching the aftermath of what had just happened, he understood immediately that it would never leave him. The squall that had caused everything was narrow and moved fast. Within minutes of the collapse, it had passed and the bay was clearing. What it left behind in the water below the broken bridge was a scene of wreckage on a scale that none of the first responders who arrived had ever encountered or imagined encountering. Two Florida Department of Transportation divers named Robert Raiola and Mike Betts had been on their way to the Sunshine Skyway that morning for a routine bridge inspection. They had stopped at a cafe near the bridge approach to get coffee when they heard the news come through on the television mounted on the wall. They left immediately, reached a boat ramp near the bridge, and were waved through by law enforcement already closing off the area. What Raiola found when he got to the water would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was the first diver to enter the Greyhound bus. It was resting on its roof at the bottom of the bay in complete darkness, and he would describe for decades afterward what he saw inside, in terms that made clear this was not something a person stores and moves past. You carry it. The Eckerd College Marine Rescue Team arrived first on the scene, a group trained for exactly this kind of emergency, and they began working the surface of the water immediately. Coast Guard vessels followed. Private boats appeared without being asked, their owners having heard the news and come to help. A firefighter named Gerard Chalmers was among the first divers in the water and would later tell reporters that he developed a bridge phobia as a result of what he saw that day, that he could no longer cross a bridge without a physical fear response taking hold of him. These were not soft men. They were professionals and they were experienced, and the Sunshine Skyway collapse broke something in many of them. The brutal truth that settled over the rescue operation within the first hour was that there was no one left to rescue. The water was 40 feet deep in places, and the wreckage was extensive and the currents were moving. One by one, divers brought up bodies from inside submerged vehicles, from the twisted steel of the roadway, from the floor of the bay. Autopsies would later determine that 6 of the 35 victims had drowned. The rest died the moment they hit the water, the fall from that height, leaving no possibility of survival. 35 people who had driven across a bridge on a rainy morning and had not made it to the other side. Wesley McIntyre had been pulled from the water by the Summit Venture's crew and sat quietly aboard the ship as the recovery operation unfolded around him. He was the only living person brought out of that bay that day. The weight of it would never leave him. He was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder in the months that followed. He never returned to work. Every May 9th, he would return to the bridge and stand at the rail and watch the morning Greyhound pass beneath him in silence. He died in 1989, 9 years after the disaster, carrying what the water had given him. The port of Tampa remained completely closed to shipping traffic for 4 days after the collapse, the wreckage of the bridge blocking the channel that all commercial vessels used to reach the port. It did not reopen even for shallow draft vessels until May 13th, and normal shipping operations did not resume until June 23rd. The economic consequences were immediate and significant. The bow of the Summit Venture, still lodged partly against the broken pier, was covered in twisted steel rebar and pieces of the concrete span. Photographs taken the hours after the collapse showed the ship trapped in the wreckage like something out of a nightmare, the broken edge of the bridge roadway dangling above the hull, the water below still turbid from everything that had fallen into it. In the days and weeks after the collapse, as Tampa Bay moved through its grief and the national news turned its full attention to the disaster, a question formed that would take years to answer, and that, even after every court had ruled and every inquiry had concluded, would refuse to settle cleanly in the public mind. Whose fault was it? John Laro became the target almost immediately. He was the man at the helm. He was the one who had made the decision to continue through deteriorating conditions. He was the one whose ship had struck the bridge. In a disaster of this magnitude, people need someone to hold accountable, and Laro was available. Rumors spread that he had been drinking. His attorney, a 30-year-old Tampa lawyer named Steve Yared, who was brought in by the Pilots Association, spent months demonstrating that Laro did not drink at all. Not alcohol, not even coffee. The rumors were false, and they caused real damage to a man who was already destroyed by what had happened. The official investigations told a more complicated story. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted a 10-day hearing at which 28 witnesses testified. The board's final ruling was 3-2, a narrow and contested finding, that Laro bore partial responsibility for the disaster because of his decision to continue the transit after losing both visual and radar references in the storm. But the same report identified two other critical contributing factors that the 3-2 margin against Laro sometimes overshadowed. First, the National Weather Service had failed to issue any maritime severe weather warning for Tampa Bay that morning. The warning was issued only after the bridge had already fallen. Second, the conditions that confronted Laro once the microburst hit were classified by investigators as conditions beyond what any pilot could reasonably have been expected to anticipate or overcome. The wind shift that pushed the Summit Venture off course happened in seconds and was not predictable from any information available. A state grand jury cleared Laro of negligence entirely. On Christmas Eve of 1980, a Florida administrative law judge named Chris Bentley issued a formal ruling that Laro had not acted negligently and had responded reasonably to the conditions he faced. The civil litigation produced a different result. The families of the 35 victims filed wrongful death claims against Hercules Carriers, the ship's owner, and the Chinese shipping company Huaquang that employed the crew. A 2-week non-jury trial found that the ship's master, Captain Lu Suing-Chu, had failed to exercise his right to reclaim command of the vessel when conditions worsened, a failure the court held him and his employer responsible for. Huaquang and Hercules were ordered to pay the state of Florida $19 million for the destruction of the bridge, and the families of each victim received approximately $300,000. The Summit Venture herself sailed on for 13 more years before being quietly removed from the Liberian Ship Registry in November of 1993. There is no record of where she went after that. Laro returned briefly to harbor piloting after the investigations concluded, but within months he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Some who knew him believed the disease had been developing before the disaster. Others felt, and Yared was among them, that what Laro had experienced on May 9th had accelerated something that might otherwise have progressed more slowly. It almost does not matter which was true. What mattered was that Laro spent the final 22 years of his life in declining health, progressively confined to a wheelchair, never fully free of the guilt that the courts had told him was not his to carry. He studied Buddhism in search of peace. He remained Catholic. He talked to God and reportedly screamed at God, and never quite found the absolution he was looking for. His attorney called him the 36th victim of the Sunshine Skyway disaster, and the people who knew him best agreed. John Laro died on August 31st, 2002, at the age of 59. Governor Bob Graham had a decision to make, and he made it quickly. The damaged 1971 southbound span of the original Sunshine Skyway was gone, destroyed beyond any reasonable repair. The surviving 1954 northbound span had not been struck and was structurally intact. Florida could rebuild what it had lost, restore the pair of bridges to what they had been, and move forward. Or it could do something more. Graham chose more. On January 31st, 1981, he announced that Florida would not rebuild the old bridge. It would build a new one, a better one that would carry with it every lesson the disaster had delivered. The engineering brief that the Florida Department of Transportation put out in early 1981 was specific about what the new bridge had to be. The main span had to be wider, substantially wider than the 800-foot gap the Summit Venture had failed to navigate. The clearance above the water had to be higher. The shipping channel beneath the bridge had to be relocated slightly to the east, giving incoming vessels more time to complete the demanding turn in the channel before they reached the most vulnerable section of the structure. And the bridge's support piers had to be protected in a way that the original bridge had never been, because the original bridge had assumed that ships would not hit it, and that assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. The contract to design the new Sunshine Skyway was awarded to an engineering group called Fig and Muller, who proposed a cable-stayed concrete bridge, a design that was well established in Europe, but had rarely been attempted at this scale in the United States. The concept is as elegant as it is structurally sound. Two concrete towers rise from the center of the span, and from each tower a fan of cables extends outward and downward to the bridge deck, supporting the roadway's weight from above rather than from piers below. This meant fewer points of contact with the water, fewer piers for ships to potentially strike, and a main span of extraordinary length achieved without the massive substructure that traditional bridge designs required. Construction began in January of 1983. For the 4 years that construction continued, the surviving 1954 northbound span of the original Sunshine Skyway was converted to carry traffic in both directions. 2 lanes in each direction squeezed onto a bridge built for 2. It was a compromise, and everyone using it knew it, but it worked. The new bridge was completed and opened on April 30th, 1987, at a cost of $244 million, and it was immediately recognized as something extraordinary. It rose 190 feet above the water at its highest point, nearly 50 feet higher than the old bridge. The main span stretched 1,200 feet across the channel, 50% wider than what the Summit Venture had tried and failed to navigate. The roadway was 4 lanes wide on a single structure, carrying Interstate 275 traffic across the bay with a confidence the old twin spans had never quite communicated. The cables were painted yellow, bright Florida yellow, an aesthetic choice that became one of the bridge's signatures and a tribute to the sunshine the state had always claimed as its own. On a clear day, the Sunshine Skyway can be seen for miles in every direction, the yellow cables fanning from their towers like rays from a lamp, and whatever association you bring to it, fear or pride or grief or all of those things together, you cannot look at it without feeling that you are looking at something that demanded to exist. But the most important decisions made in designing the new bridge were not the aesthetic ones. They were the protective ones. Around each of the 6 piers closest to the main shipping channel, engineers installed massive cylindrical concrete barriers called dolphins, 36 of them in total, rising 17 feet above the waterline and extending all the way to the seafloor, filled with rock and reinforced against impact. These are not decorative features. Each dolphin is engineered to absorb the force of an 87,000-ton ship traveling at full speed, stopping it before it can reach the pier itself. The original bridge had offered no such protection. The new bridge offered protection that turned the scenario that had killed 35 people into a scenario that would produce structural damage to the barrier but leave the bridge standing. These were the most concrete expression of the lesson the disaster had forced the engineering world to learn. In addition to the physical barriers, the port's system, a network of 15 monitoring stations with 36 individual sensors, was installed across Tampa Bay. Every 6 minutes, by satellite and cellular relay, the system transmits real-time data on wind speed, wave height, current direction, tidal conditions, and visibility at multiple points across the shipping approach. Harbor pilots guiding vessels toward the bridge today have access to information that John Laro could only have dreamed of. They know what the wind is doing at the bend in the channel. They know if conditions have shifted. They know, in a way that no instrument available in 1980 could have told anyone, whether the bay is safe to transit. The old bridge did not disappear entirely. The center spans and main piers of both original structures were demolished in 1992. The main span brought down in a single controlled explosion and lowered into the bay in one piece. But the approach sections at both ends were preserved and repurposed. They became the Skyway Fishing Pier State Park, 2 long concrete arms extending from the shores into the bay, ending at the open water where the center spans once crossed. Families come to fish from them, and when the light is right, you can look out from the end of the pier and understand, standing above the water, roughly where the edge of the collapse span would have been on that morning in May. Some of the demolished bridge material was placed on the seafloor nearby to create artificial reefs, and the marine life that has colonized those reefs over the decades has made the area one of the better diving and fishing spots in the bay. What was once a site of catastrophe has become, quietly, a place where people gather and the water is full of life. Wesley McIntyre was the last person to drive across the surviving span of the original bridge before it was closed and demolished. He stopped at the apex, at the highest point of the old structure, and dropped 35 white carnations into the water below, one for each person who had died. Then he drove off the other side and did not look back. Those findings did not stay in Florida. Published in 1981, they became the foundation for a new national standard. In 1991, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials codified requirements for protecting bridges against vessel collision, standards that applied to any bridge newly built over navigable water and provided guidance for retrofitting older structures. For a decade, those standards were understood in the engineering community as the direct consequence of what had happened in Tampa Bay. Then, on the morning of March 26, 2024, a container ship lost power in the channel outside Baltimore Harbor, drifted into the Francis Scott Key Bridge, and brought it down in seconds. 6 people died. The Key Bridge had opened in 1977, 3 years before the Skyway disaster, and it had never been retrofitted with the protective barriers that Tampa Bay had made standard. Engineers and maritime lawyers in Florida watched the footage from Baltimore and recognized, with a grief they had hoped would never need to be felt again, exactly what they were seeing. The Bob Graham Sunshine Skyway Bridge, renamed in 2005 in honor of the governor who ordered it built, carries 60,000 vehicles across Tampa Bay every day. At the memorial on the Pinellas side, a wall carries the names of all 35 people who died on May 9, 1980. The names include John Calloway, 19 years old, who was going home to see his family for Mother's Day. They include the bus driver Mike Curtin, 42. They include Gerda Hedquist, 92. They include a baby. They include people whose ordinary morning became the last morning they ever had, for reasons that no one on that bridge could have controlled or predicted or stopped. What the Sunshine Skyway disaster gave the world, at terrible cost, was the understanding that a bridge standing over moving water is never as permanent as it looks. That the ships passing beneath it are forces of physics as much as vehicles of commerce. And that the gap between a safe crossing and a catastrophic one can be as narrow as a change in wind direction and as brief as 30 seconds. Every modern bridge built over a major shipping channel anywhere in the world carries in its design the memory of what happened in Tampa Bay. Those concrete barriers rising from the water around the piers are the most visible reminder, but they are not the only one. The question asked in every engineering review of every vulnerable crossing in the world, which is simply this: what happens if a ship hits this? And what have we done to make sure it cannot? Is a question that the Sunshine Skyway disaster made permanent. That is the legacy. It cost 35 lives to write it, but it has been written and it holds.